Now, I don't know what the collective term for a group of Sky News presenters is, a sort of a lunch of presenters, perhaps. But hopefully, no introduction required now. On my far left, Ed Conway, our data and economics editor, Samantha Washington, my fellow presenter, Trevor Phillips, my fellow presenter, and we're here really to sort of chew over what we've picked up over the course of the day. But before we do this, Sky's... I don't know whether it still is our slogan, first with breaking news. Always used to be, didn't it? But we do have some breaking news, which Ed can talk to us about, which is that we've had the latest World Economic Outlook from the IMF in the last hour or so. So, Ed, what are the highlights?
Yeah, normally this time of year I would be in Washington, but I've chosen Rotherham over Washington, D.C., and I think that was the right choice, definitely. But so the IMF are having their annual meeting at the moment, and they've just brought out their World Economic Outlook. So this is their kind of they do it every 6 months, their opportunity to look at the state of the global economy. And actually what's interesting, and it kind of feeds into, I think, stuff on all of our sessions, is they've cut their global growth forecast. And they've done it partly in the face of what we've been talking about, you know, the supply chain crunch that we're all facing. They've raised their inflation forecast, and a lot of people are looking at that and saying, you know, is that a kind of a bit of a stagflation warning? I mean, I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but nonetheless, lower growth, higher inflation, and it goes back to this point that, you know, that we are in this kind of very difficult moment at the moment. To some extent, you know, there's a good news story behind it, which is that you've got the global economy growing at the fastest rate that we have ever seen, you know, in the post-war era. We're just not used to, the machine is just not used to 6% growth, which is kind of what we've got in the UK and the US and in loads of other places. But as a result of that, the whole machine that underlies it is really struggling to keep up. And then you have kind of this energy price shock, and you've got all of the other things interacting. So the IMF's kind of put their tuppence in, and they you know, they are officially concerned, which I imagine is the story that we're going to be kind of talking about for the next few days at least.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the big themes for me that's come out of today, and Sam, certainly when you were talking to Mark Carney, it came out in spades, which is the rising costs of the transition away from fossil fuels, that pivot towards net zero. The cost is becoming ever clearer. And I wonder whether the authorities are actually being honest with publics about that around the world.
Well, I think there's a lot of debate about to what extent the government needs to be subsidising this, to what extent individuals are going to be responsible. But I thought one of the really interesting things that came out of talking to the former governor of the Bank of England was the delta in the amount of investment now going into on companies' balance sheets towards net zero goals. So he was talking about back in Paris, less than a third of countries that were there had net zero commitments, and after that, that's gone up now to 3/4 of countries. But cascading down from governments getting involved has been corporates also getting involved in green recovery and investing in green infrastructure. And he said that corresponding number had gone from 5 trillion invested on companies' balance sheets up to 90 trillion. Of course, there's still a lot of challenges because 90 trillion is an awful lot of money, but we need hundreds of trillions to invest in green infrastructure. Some of the sectors are already profitable, I think solar and wind, and you can see what's happened with the electric car industry as well. You know that you have the electric car companies that are worth more than a lot of the other top car companies combined, but it's getting that money, which is out there, isn't it, Ed? I mean, that's the size of the global savings glut that we need to somehow incentivize to get into these green sectors, some of which are not yet profitable. And it's about getting that right combination of government support, corporate finance, and getting all those incentives aligned to get the money where it needs to be.
Well, it is. I mean, the world is awash with liquidity, but at the same time, with so many people chasing these assets, there's going to be asset price inflation. And you're already seeing it in the elevated prices that the likes of BP and Shell are paying, for example, to develop offshore wind farms.
I think, you know, what's interesting is that it feels real. You know, all of us have been to kind of conferences, you know, perhaps like this one or others, where people have talked very boldly about what they're going to do about net zero, about kind of greenifying their processes. But in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, it's just started to feel more real, hasn't it? And that's kind of what Mark Carney was kind of talking about. That has turned into real money now. It's turned into real commitments. But what's interesting, like you say, Ian, is the fact that it's very easy to make bold promises. It's very easy to be at COP and make a promise about something that you haven't necessarily got a kind of strict plan for, like Sam was quizzing Mark Carney about. But when that becomes real and you actually have to implement it, and it leads to higher inflation, it leads to higher energy costs, then things can get crunchy. And I feel like we're kind of getting to that crunchy stage now.
Yeah.
Solar is much cheaper now. Why is it cheaper? It's cheaper partly because we've got better at making solar panels, but it's cheaper partly because most of these solar panels are made in China, and what is powering that process? Coal. And coal is very cheap. And now suddenly China is deciding, whether it's actually going to start using coal, actually be using as much coal as it was before, and suddenly solar might not look quite so cheap in the future. So, this is where it gets interesting, I say, in italics, because I think the next few decades are going to be more crunchy when it comes to the net zero debate, and it's going to affect all of our lives in a way that it hasn't before. And I imagine the public and many of your businesses are now actually thinking this is something we need to think very seriously about. It's real.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? Because I think credibility is going to be so important. To get the money flowing to where it needs to be, you have to accept that government policy is credible, that their commitments are credible. One of the things I was pushing Mark Carney about is the UK government credible on its own net zero commitments? Why are we even considering investing in a coal mine, in gas and oil exploration in Cambo Sands? And he gave quite a politician's answer to it, didn't he? But I think in essence what he was saying is at least there's an inquiry. They haven't just gone ahead with it. And when you do the inquiry, you have to look at the cost and benefits of it, which might not sound very satisfactory, because there is another answer, which is just say no. But actually, if you do the inquiry and you're exposing the fact that there won't be any more need for what comes out of this coal mine from 2035, then you start to think, the financial institutions won't be investing in these things if they think that it's going to be a product that doesn't have lifespan anymore.
But you need coking. See, the thing is, you need coking coal for solar panels. That's, again, it's the complexity that I don't know if government has actually fully comprehended that, but you need coking coal, not just to make steel.
Does Kermit the Frog understand it?
Yeah, I don't think Kermit the Frog has got that one either. But I think he's slightly further ahead than some politicians, dare I say. But it's not, the green transition involves creating a lot of carbon. And that's the paradox that I don't think has been fully explained to, to the general public and maybe even to the politicians as well. And that's why, he gave a politician's answer. But I think until that has been properly explained about what the trade-offs of saying no to it, I don't think it's easy. I genuinely don't think it's easy, is it?
The sort of mechanisms you need in that transition period are things like carbon offsetting, and then you get into the arguments, well, you're just allowing people to pay their way out of their emissions, but you need to get from A to B, so there has to be a way to it.
Yeah, Trevor, you grill politicians every week. Do you ever get the sense that there could be more honesty from them about the cost of the transition?
Well, I think there could be more honesty if I thought they knew what they were doing, actually. People can only be as honest as they know. And I do think, unfortunately, that in politics, exactly as Ed was just saying, we haven't really started to have a proper conversation about what many of these things mean. So, for example, one of the things that surprises me is that politics isn't talking about what, I don't know if it is, but it could be an ESG bubble. There is that 90 trillion. It is going somewhere, but it's going more. It's tracking. It's marching in pursuit of assets where things are promised. Now, the big example there is fintech, where people who haven't made a profit and show no signs of making a profit are being valued at $5 billion. But I think that is also true to some extent in terms of quote unquote green assets, that there's chunks of money going in places where there might be the promise, but actually nobody really knows. And the second thing is, I think Sam's point, very, very important. It's going to be harder before it gets easier. There's going to have to be, if any of these technologies is successful, there's going to be a load of money chucked into it before anything comes out of the other end. the example we have the example before us. We've spent gigantic sums on nuclear, now, and actually we sort of knew what would happen with nuclear, that eventually it would pay off. But even now, 60, 70 years on from Sizewell B and all that, it's only just starting to wash its face. So I think there's a big problem that politics basically is not equipped to deal with, because when I talk to politicians, there's no point me talking to them about what will it look like in 2050, because most of the time they can't even see what it's going to look like at 2050 tonight.
They're just governed by the electoral cycle, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're thinking in 5-year cycles rather than 50-year ones.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the points that you tried to tease out of Mark Carney was whether the UK is setting the right example as we approach COP26.
Yeah, I mean, the UK government's been criticised by its own independent climate change committee, as I'm sure many of you know, for not having really a detailed plan. We don't know, what the roadmap is to get to net zero. We don't know what it's going to cost, and we're also hearing a lot about the tensions with Treasury. About is Treasury going to stump up for this when we've got COVID to pay for and all the rest of it. So just remind me of, sorry, someone was talking to me in my ear and I lost track of what I was saying.
No, I was just saying, what did you make of his answer then when you tried to tease that out of him?
Tease it out of him about
He was quite a politician, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
But he's a great politician.
What I thought was interesting, though, is that I didn't get much out of him on that, because it was all very policy-based and, he could give me one of his rehearsed answers. But when I was asking him about basically the style point, which was, the way the Prime Minister frames the language around this. I mean, he references Kermit the Frog about it's not easy being green, and he's talking about bunny huggers. Is that helpful? And he sort of smirked, didn't he? It was more what he didn't say when I asked him, is that language that you would use? And he said no. And he's obviously probably one of the people in the world taking climate the most seriously. So I think you can deduce what you may.
I think you got more of it out of him. I'm used to. Sam and I have both interviewed Mark Carney before, and we were both talking about this backstage. Sometimes, sometimes he's quite tough to get stuff out of. But I felt actually what you saw there was quite a good Mark Carney interview, where he did actually go a little bit further than he usually does. And I think both on the coal mine, he talked slightly kind of more freely about that than I expected. Also about energy bills for households and businesses in this country. And again, it comes down to the fact that a lot of this stuff is no longer academic. I think that's it, isn't it? This is becoming real. It's real for many of your kind of executive decisions. It's real for many households as well. And you can't avoid it. You can't just talk in kind of generalities anymore about this, which makes it more tangible for us as a news organisation, but also for the country.
Yeah.
We haven't got an awful lot of time left, but before we do, Trevor, if I can put this politely, you have more miles on the clock than the rest of us. We've had this sort of...
He's younger than you.
Certainly in spirit.
It's the drugs in, it helps.
I mean, we've just gone through this period where we've had queues at petrol stations. The talk is of inflation, of stagflation. There's more than a sort of whiff of the 1970s about this. As someone who's around in the late 1970s, I mean, I was there too, but I was only at school. I hasten to add. I mean, do you think the comparisons?
He's going to get into many knots here.
do you think these comparisons with the late 70s are being overdone?
I don't think they're being overdone, but I think they might mislead us. In summary, I mean, I interviewed Michael Heseltine, who was a minister in the 73 when we had the 3-day week and all that. And I was saying to him that I was a student at the time, and they locked us out of the laboratory because, we didn't have the power to do the work that we were supposed to do. And if I had to go to the library, I mean, no student goes to the library in daylight, for God's sake. I mean, you'd have to have a candle. Happily, I didn't go to the library ever, so it didn't matter. But the point is that I think what we were seeing there was the end of something. The disruption was we could see the end of primary industries, coal and so on, coming. We didn't know what was coming next, but that was all about the end of something and how we managed that process. Today, I think what we're talking about is the beginning of something, and we just don't quite know how that's going to work. And it struck me that the panel that I was doing, just thinking about it, Simone Roche used a good example of a digital company that's succeeding in lead. And it struck me, what we're talking about now is a destruction to some extent of geography. Now, the North used to be the North because of coal and salt and iron and ports. Now, in a world where those things have gone, frankly, those industries have gone somewhere else, and what we're doing now is what Hugh's talking about in Leeds, geography is destroyed. And, one of the things I'm just wondering is if we've slightly kid ourselves the whole of today that there is going to be something separate called the North, and whether what separates us is not going to be the primary, economics and so on, but it's just whether how you say the word for the thing that you get into when you really want to wash your whole body. I'm trying not to say it. Begins with B. Bath.
Yes.
Or bath.
No, it's a perfectly good point. And I mean, the way that digital infrastructure is being rolled out, the working from home phenomenon is very much a part of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that is basically all we've got time for. Trevor, Sam,
Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much. That concludes today's event. We've really enjoyed being up here in this absolutely astonishing building, somewhat chilly at times, but hope it hasn't been too uncomfortable for you with the heating on. Thank you for engaging in some fascinating discussions and for being here and sharing your thoughts with us in person and online. We are going to be back at some point very soon with more Big Ideas Live. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed for your company today.